All right. Morning, everyone. If you're in the breakout for the community risk reduction track here, you're in the right place. I've got the pleasure to introduce Mr. Jim Crawford here. He's got a very extensive bio, but doesn't want me to go over the whole thing, so we'll hit some highlights here. 45 years in the fire service. Beginning as a firefighter, worked his way through the ranks. Finally retired. Chief Fire Marshal, Portland, Oregon, then Vancouver, Washington. Was one of the original founders of the Vision 2020 project. Also worked as a consultant for the U.S. Fire Administration, NFPA, and a lot of other things. Author of numerous articles and a book on the topic of community risk reduction. Jim Crawford.
Morning, everyone. I just wanted to explain, I appreciate the fact that there's so few people in the room. My wife has underlying conditions, so I tend to be on the cautious side, but given the size of the room and the air movement that we got, I feel comfortable. If this is okay with you, I'll just do my thing and we'll get on with it. I was going to say I don't often get asked to talk about the history of community risk reduction. In fact, I've never been asked to talk about the history of community risk reduction. I don't think it's what many people think that it is. We'll find out shortly. I do want to admit up front that part of this is personal. So I'm not a historian. This is not academic style history of community risk reduction. I'm not honestly sure that anybody could put their finger on a precise time. We're going to talk about it a little bit. And it begins with this. What do you think community risk reduction is? This is the part where you talk. Life and property, okay? Not you guys. No. Go ahead. Bueller, anybody? Identifying hazards. Good.
Putting your resources towards those hazards.
What are your resources to deal with those hazards? Okay. Is it prevention? Is it education? Okay. Well, hopefully part of this presentation is not going to make any sense to you at all till I get done. That's my intent. You'll have a hard time reading this, but I started doing some research on the history of fire departments. So if anybody has ever delved into this kind of thing, Egypt is often referred to. A man from Alexandria, and I have no idea how to pronounce his name. Ctesibius, let's call it that. One of the people known for establishing one of the first fire response capabilities. Later built a water pump around 3rd century BC. But it's really Rome that most people focus on. Marcus Licinius Crassus. I thought that was a character in Spartacus, not sure. In any event, he was credited with starting fire departments, and I thought that this was interesting. 500 men came from a wealthy family, and he created a business model where he would put your fire out for pay. How fire stations evolved. And this is just doing some online research. You could do more yourself. Again, back to the Egyptians, but mostly they were just places to store equipment. They weren't where firefighters hung out. First accounted fire station, Ignatius Rufus, who provided service again for a fee, firefighting in Rome, was not initially a free service. And again, they mention Crassus. 24 BC time period. How about the United States? I found this interesting. The first recorded fire, Jamestown, Virginia, January 7th, 1608. What I found interesting about this is that later, I think he became the governor, Captain John Smith, you familiar with that character? He wrote in his journal, I think that I might be safer living among the wild Indian territory because of all of the, not his words, but stupid people who were misfiring their muskets and starting their houses on fire. And that was the very first time it happened in the United States. How about Benjamin Franklin? You've no doubt heard of him being attributed as one of the founding fathers, if you'll forgive the term, for the fire service in the United States. The time period was around 1730, 1736, where he started the volunteer fire companies in Pennsylvania. But it was also around that time period, and some of you may already know this, where the insurance companies were heavily involved in this. Are you familiar with the insurance plaques that go on the side, went on the side of buildings? And if you were covered by that insurance company, then they would put your fire out. And if you weren't, then they wouldn't. And if you were up for grabs, sometimes they would have fights to see who would put the fire out. What else was Benjamin Franklin known for, aside from air baths, which requires alcohol, and we won't talk about that today? Common saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So Benjamin Franklin, and I'm quite certain that others were thinking in terms of, well, how could we have prevented this from happening? And no doubt around the same time period. But some of the earliest regulations in colonial times had to do with a requirement for keeping a bucket, a fire bucket at your house. It wasn't prevention, it was part of the suppression operation. And everybody was required to have one for the bucket brigade. There were no government-run fire departments until around the time of the American Civil War. And in 1853, Cincinnati, Ohio featured the first professional fire department, made up of 100% of paid employees. What's the point of all of this? Is that it's evolving. It doesn't start at one particular point in time, and it's not a straight line progression. It kind of starts and stops and starts again. And then we have the historical fires, and what's the significance of things like this? Well, the Great Boston Fire happened in 1872. Which big fire occurred in 1871 that everyone knows about? Take a guess. Great Chicago Fire. You know another one that occurred in 1871, same time? Peshtigo, Wisconsin. Much more intense. I would think that would be high on the list in Montana, where your wildland fire issue is significant, let's say. You have a bad year here? We did in the Northwest, Oregon, Washington, Northern California. So I didn't track much beyond that, but I'm sure that you guys have the same problem here. And the Peshtigo fire was a wildfire, and it did far more damage than the Great Chicago Fire, but nobody talks about it. It's worth looking up. What other fires in history? And why am I talking about them? I'll get to that in just a minute. What other great fires can you think of? Beg pardon?
I can't think of the name, the garment shop in New York.
Going to talk about that in a little bit. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire. Yep. That was significant. Why? Do you remember why?
Locked exits.
Locked exits. So the garment industry, and mostly women and children, working in the garment industry, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, 1911, but the owner was worried about them taking breaks, unauthorized breaks, leaving the workspace, so the exits were blocked. I'll come back to that one briefly because there's a person around that of significance for the history of community risk reduction many of you won't know about. What other fires?
Or Lady of Angels.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Lady of Angels.
Lady of Angels school fire. That was in the 50s, I think, Greg, wasn't it? And what was the issue there? School kids, vulnerable population, and the ability to exit. There's a common theme with all of those. Iroquois Theater fire, does that ring a bell? What was the issue there? Exiting and people's ability to get out. Okay? How about a little bit more recent? Beg pardon?
The Forward Rhode Island.
Station nightclub fire, yep, in Rhode Island. And how did that fire start? Pyrotechnics. Did they have a permit? Nope. What else was in the building that created a problem for them? Beg pardon? The sound dampening foam that they had in there. Have you ever seen the video of that fire? That is chilling to watch real human beings die in a fire that didn't have to happen. So their indoor pyrotechnics caught the foam on fire and it rolled across the top. And there was one other thing that you may not know. Where did people go to get out? Same way they went in. They didn't look for the other exits. So they were stacked up like cordwood at the main entrance and exit. Literally. And I also heard that there were security people in the room who were telling them, nope, this exit is for the band. You can't go out this way. Don't take that as fact. I just remember reading that in passing. But the big issue was, how often had that building been inspected? When was the last time it was inspected? What did they find? What did they do about it? You're beginning to get the connection. One more. MGM Grand. And what happened there?
Delay, no sprinklers, and then a delay for detection.
Okay, let me use this, and thank you for that, as an opportunity to say, what happened with all of these fires? What occurred? Thank you. Code changes started occurring with these fires, beginning back in Great Boston Fire in 1872. And people started looking at things, and in particular, and I'll talk about this next, but the Triangle Shirtwaist fire was the foundation for a lot, and I'll talk about that. People have always asked the question, what happens with you when a significant fire or a fire death occurs locally? Here's what happened for me, and I told you that a lot of this is personal anecdotal experience. Could this happen in our community? What's the answer?
Yes.
Yep. What have you done to prepare for that? How could this situation be prevented? Okay? So keep that in mind, and let's fast forward to one other. Ghost ship fire. You familiar with that one? What was the community? California? Oakland. And Oakland had had a fire some years before. Anybody remember the Oakland Hills? I guess you'd call it an urban interface wildfire because it happened within their community. I think I remember correctly that there was something like 3,500 buildings destroyed in that fire. Don't take that as fact. That's just my recollection. And I didn't look it up directly before coming here. But you know what they couldn't do after that? They couldn't get an ordinance passed to ban wood shingle shakes. Why is that, do you think? Because they look pretty. People liked them. They liked the looks of them. And because somebody sold them a bill of goods on what? You can put fire retardant on these wood shingle shakes and it's going to protect them just fine. Now, I'm the one who said bill of goods. Why? Because the fire retardant doesn't stay. It wears off, it washes off. That's the situation that you've got. But they could not get an ordinance passed banning them. Fast forward, same community, Ghost Ship Fire. It's an artists' community. Started, my recollection, probably electrical. Does that ring a bell? Was it a legal occupancy? No, it wasn't. They weren't supposed to be living in there. What was the building designed for? It was designed to be a warehouse, right? And they converted it over to living, an artist community in there and doing performances, and they were off the street and they weren't cold, and there were a lot of reasons why the community found it valuable and why they thought it was very cool, and one particular event occurs. So let me sidestep here for a minute and ask you, how many inspectable occupancies do you have in your community?
Should it scare you to say, I don't know?
Wow, you are my new best friend. I don't know. And probably most don't. What happens just about the time you think you've got a handle on every inspectable occupancy in your community? It changes. Somebody moves out, somebody else moves in, they split it into two, it's two different business occupancies, you know, in the same space. It's really hard to get a handle on that. But if you're not trying, you're falling into the trap of the Ghost Ship Fire, and that is, we didn't know, or at least we're telling people that we didn't know that they were there. What in the heck do all of these things have to do with CRR? The obvious you've already picked up on. It's already starting to talk about how these things could have been changed. What about code changes that occur as a result of that? But I'm going to go back again and talk about some of the equipment. 2nd century BC, Ctesibius, I'm going to pronounce it that way this time, of Alexandria develops the first hand pump for firefighting. 1650, Hans Hauch in Germany, the first one using compressed air. 1730, Richard Newsham of London, it was the first hand pumped. And by the way, some of the first recorded in the United States were in New York City, where they had Newsham fire engines, fire pumps. But the first ones built here were in 1743. Thomas Lote, first fire engines that were made. What about other things, like the first helmet developed by Jacobus Turk, 1730 in New York, to go with their Newsham fire engines? They were getting hot and heavy into this, pun intended. We're going to be ready. 1836, that's a typo, my apologies, Henry Gattacap added a shield. That was novel for the time. So for probably close to, well, a little over 100 years, they're facing the fire and realized if I put a shield between me and the fire, it's going to protect me a little bit as I'm going in. 1863, first breathing apparatus of a sort, 2 canvas bags lined with rubber filled with air. And it wasn't until post-World War II, the Scott Air Pack developed in 1945, compressed air, and that led to the first standard. So 1971 isn't the year, it's the number of the standard at NFPA that refers to Standard for Protective Ensembles. Okay? So, moving forward a little bit, let me go back to 1911, Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. We've already talked about the situation, but how many people are familiar with Francis Perkins? Anybody? Okay. I find that interesting. The reason that I do is because what she did was phenomenal. So Frances Perkins wasn't involved in anything. She was a New York socialite. She was having tea with friends nearby when the fire occurred. And they went to see what was happening. And what was happening was 146 people dying, some of them leaping off of the upper stories. What does that sound like to you? 9/11. And you remember, I'm sure you remember the videos and perhaps the stories from some of the firefighters who were there, where they had to stop and time their entrance to go into the building to avoid people who were jumping. Can't think of very many things more horrible than that. But what did Frances do? Frances was recommended by Theodore Roosevelt to sit on the New York Factory Investigation Commission. And what did they come up with? They started codifying the rules about the exits. And then they started going beyond that. And they started looking at things like workplace safety. Eventually, Frances became the Secretary of Labor for FDR, Franklin Roosevelt. And the work that she did led to, and I won't say that it's a direct connection, but this is part of my theory about the history of all of these things. It's not just pop and it happens. One thing leads to another, builds on another, and leads to the formation of Occupational Safety Health Administration and workplace safety, which in turn leads to things like the New Deal, because what we're trying to do is to care for the working class. She was the person who was an architect of all of those things, beginning with Teddy Roosevelt and later with Franklin Delano. It's a fascinating story. This is where it starts to get personal for me. And hopefully you're still a little bit confused about exactly how all of this stuff fits together. I'm going to do my best to bring it all together, I promise you that. We'll see whether it works or not. But for me, it started with work in 1980 at the Fire Academy, and I'll come back to that, but I started looking at things that had to do with prevention some time ago, because that's where I started as a firefighter, but I wasn't there long. I was a talker. Chief said, we're going to put you in. We're going to have a public information education officer, Clackamas County Fire District 1, suburb of Portland, Oregon, 1979. I started at 75 as a volunteer. I was only on the line for, like 4 or 5 years. I was the first public information education officer. If you figure that, I was the first PIEIO of Clackamas County Fire District 1. And what did I start learning? What things are most effective? How many people know about the effectiveness of home safety visits and where they started? Does that ring a bell with you? If you had any training in that area? I think you're going to get some later today, would be my guess. The fact is, they're one of the most effective things that can be done. In the first instance I was able to find of them was 1914 in Portland, Oregon, where the local news article said that people were really upset because they were required to have an inspection in their home. This wasn't a voluntary home safety visit. This was a requirement in the city, and they were upset that their privacy was being invaded by the fire marshal at the time. That's what the story was about. So I know that they were doing them. Fast forward to the early 1980s in Edmonds, Washington, where there's another great example of home safety visits. And what happens? They get federal money. Some of you may be old enough to remember CETA employees, federal money to give people work, and they put them to work going door to door and checking for hazards in people's homes. They did it for 2 years. They dropped the fire incident rate in Edmonds by 62% in 2 years. This is data from TriData, Phil Shaman. And 62% drop was astounding. And it happened everywhere in the city, not just where they were doing the inspections. People were getting word about what was going on and started to clean up the hazards in their home on their own, regardless of whether they had a visit or not. What happened? 2 years later, the money runs out, the program stops, and the fire incident rate went back up. It's one of the best examples that we have of cause and effect for prevention programs in the history of what we call community risk reduction. For me, it began here in 1980 at the National Fire Academy, where I was introduced to the 5-step planning process. Does anyone have any idea what I'm talking about? Okay. Just for the remainder of the discussion here, you can keep your hands down. Five-step planning process was predicated on, somebody said it earlier, I'm sorry I can't remember exactly who, but identifying hazards, that part. It all began with, what are the problems we're going to deal with? How do you know that? How do you find that out? Bueller? How do you know what your hazards are in your community?
Identify the assess.
You have to identify them, and how do you identify them?
Do an assessment.
You do an assessment. You do a risk assessment. There are different ways that you can do this, and that's not what this class is about. It's about the history, but you are going to get some material, I'm fairly confident today, about the CRR process and the interrelationship between that and 5-step planning process. Identification of the problems, selection of which problems you're going to deal with, designing programs that are designed to interrupt the sequence in those particular problems, whatever they are, and evaluating the results. That led in turn, and does anybody remember master planning? So my job was not only PIEIO, but I told the chief, I got to go back on the line. There's no future for me here. It's a small department. There's only 3 stations, for crying out loud. What are you going to do with me? I got to go back on the line. Nope. Going to create a position for you, Jimmy. You're a good talker. We want you to help us with planning. So I started doing master planning, and then later budgeting. And master planning at the time was calculating fire flows for individual buildings. You could translate how much water you needed to prevent flashover from occurring for a particular building, and that translated into how many people do you need, how quickly do they need to be there. Does that make sense to you all? Does anybody here ever experience or do master planning in your career? Okay, good. Do you remember RAVE? Risk, hazard, assessment, valuation, evaluation, something like that. It was a computer program, and they still make reference to it at the Fire Academy, but it never worked. It was supposed to help you do risk assessments for your community. They kind of abandoned it. For me, that personally led to a couple of different things that were foundational in my view of how community risk reduction evolved. So I was information officer, education officer, responsible for planning. And what was the next step after master planning? Anybody remember standards of cover from the United Kingdom? What were those about? Those were about how many firefighters you need, how many fire stations do you need, how many, where do you configure them, etc. Those were standards of cover. and they started being adopted in the United States. Wrong word. They started being promoted in the United States. And this was in the late, I'll say 80s, when it really started taking off. I can't remember the year exactly, but it's when we started having discussions nationally about deployment. The first such effort was NFPA 1500, which is a safety standard at NFPA. And there was a huge fight to include language in the safety standard that said, in order to protect firefighters, you have to have so many people on an engine and so many people on a truck. And it got shot down. And the next step was a document called NFPA 1200. So if it's not safety, then it's going to be about deployment of all of these resources for firefighting. And we're going to tell you how many people need to be on an engine, et cetera, and that got shut down, NFPA 1200. So it later changed, evolved, and was resurrected, and the reason that I know this is because I was actively involved in NFPA at the time. Sat on the Standards Council, and I witnessed some of these fights as they came through. This is anecdotal. Doubt whether it's anybody's history but mine. But that became NFPA 1710 and 1720. How many people are familiar with those? Deployment standards for fire department. That's how things started evolving in the US. Along what lines? Along the lines of emergency operations, predominantly. Would you agree that that's the predominant focus of the fire service, is operations and response? And there are reasons for that. Well, I'll just say, most people don't say, I want to form a fire department because we need an inspector to go around and inspect all of these business occupancies and cost me thousands of dollars to correct code violations. Why do they start a fire department? Because they want somebody to respond and help them in the event of an emergency. I'll come back to that part of it as well, but that's the reason why so much is devoted to that. And as these things are all evolving, the UK starts doing a turn. And the turn that they start doing is to say, well, where does prevention fit into this? Where does prevention fit into this grand scheme of things on deployment? How many inspectors could do inspections if inspectors could do inspections? What did that become? What standard was that? Is that at NFPA? 1730. Similar. And they asked some of the basic questions, some of the same basic questions. How many prevention folks do we need? That's a longer story, also requires alcohol. What happens at the national level in the United States? 1973, are you familiar with America Burning? Can you read these? It's kind of hard. I did my best to take a screenshot of this because I thought that it was pretty heavy-duty stuff to come from then President of the United States. Not going to read it for you. But he's talking about prevention being a priority. Notice the year, 1972. In 73 is when America Burning comes out, the national report. When I was first exposed to that report by a neighboring captain of a neighboring fire department, and they showed us the pictures of the burn victims in the America Burning report, is when I became motivated to get involved in prevention and become PIEIO. Thank you. I'm here till Thursday. Try the veal. 85 at the National Fire Academy Executive Fire Officer Program, they started talking about strategic analysis of fire prevention programs. This is back at the time when Mary Marshal, some of you may know Mary, was involved in the development of these courses and later delivery. And at the same time in 85, there was a report put out called Injury in America. And Injury in America influenced heavily Mary and others who were developing these classes to expand beyond just fire and to start looking at what? the other emergencies that we respond to? How much of your response capability is oriented towards fire, and what percentage of the calls that you go on are fire? And how many of them are medical related? So they began looking at, instead of just fire and fire prevention, it was community and later community risk reduction in the 80s at the National Fire Academy. And you can see the progression of the courses there: developing fire and life safety strategies, fire and life safety, strategic analysis of community risk reduction, leading community risk reduction. The one here that really leaps out, and it did at the time for me, was local risk reduction for company officers. Why? Because this was the first CRR class at the National Fire Academy that was designed for the operations track. This wasn't in the prevention track. This was in operations. And what did that mean? It meant that every company officer should know something about the risks in their station response area or fire management area or whatever you call it locally. And that's when it started developing at the Fire Academy. Some of the people involved in these efforts, you may recognize the names I've already mentioned: Mary Marshal, Gary Bassett, Don Mano, Ed Kirtley, some of the early pioneers in this field who were fighting tooth and toenail to get these topics introduced at the National Fire Academy. For me, it began in Portland, Oregon in 1987. Because I didn't know this stuff was going on. I just had that one class and 5-step planning process, which oddly enough turns out to be very similar to the community risk reduction planning process. And what I learned about it led to the formation of a smoke alarm campaign for inner Northeast Portland that had 5% of the population, accounted for 26% of the deaths, largely African American community in Portland. And you should have seen those folks get mobilized. Once we identified the problem for them and we reached out and started working with them, they went gangbusters. The one woman in particular, who is still a friend of mine, Lenita Duke, I hired to go door to door because nobody else would go door to door in that part of town. She was doing pre and post surveys for us. She gave me a switchblade as a going away present when the campaign was over. Lenita's a tough lady, still. 0 fire deaths in that community for, I'm gonna say, 10 or more years after that, because she went out and found 200 volunteers to go door to door, knock on doors and check people's smoke alarms, replace them, and to look for hazards. That's how it played out for me. But then we started something in Portland called service delivery planning. What the heck was that? It was about identifying hazards for the individual fire station areas and figuring out which ones we were going to intervene in. It was influenced by the work done in the United Kingdom on standards of cover. But we wanted to include prevention in that, so we did. What was the end result? We end up calling it community emergency services. Why? Because the chief wanted something equivalent to community policing. We were getting our butts kicked in the budget process. Police were getting money that was being taken from the fire department and given to them for a thing called community policing. We got to do the same thing, Jim. You're a talker, go figure this out. So we went, and I made the mistake of thinking that it was community interaction at the fire station level. Open the doors, get the people in there so that they know what the firefighters are about and what they're doing, and I was wrong. Police were going to every neighborhood association meeting in Portland. We had to have the firefighters do the same thing. Go to the neighborhood association meeting. Why? Well, because the police are going. So the firefighters are standing in the back of the room at the neighborhood association, drinking their coffee, eating their cookies, wondering what in the hell they're doing there. The neighborhood association is looking at the firefighters in the back of the room, drinking their coffee, eating their cookies, wondering what the hell are you doing here? And the police stand up with the crime statistics for that neighborhood and go, this is what's happening in your neighborhood. Could we work together proactively to do something about them? And the light finally went on. That is what we should be doing. We should be engaging with the community and solving problems. Am I making sense to you? because that's when it tripped for me. A little more recently, it flowed into, and this also requires alcohol. It's a longer story. I won't be here long enough for that, sorry. But a national planning process that led to the formation of the Vision 2020 project. It's like, how do I say this? In some people's minds, it's never happened before. Well, yeah, it has. Nationally, we've looked at doing risk assessments of a sort. America Burning is one that I already mentioned, but 1913 National Fire Prevention Convention, 47 President Truman's Conference on Prevention, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What was different about Vision 2020 was 13 individual locations around the country that focused on a risk assessment for the country. What are the gaps and what should we be doing about them? And that led to a physical meeting in 2007, late 2000, no, it was 2008, where 170 people came together and agreed to coalesce around different strategies that were gaps in the national framework. So rather than reinventing the wheel, what were the gaps? If you can see strategy 3, it's about prevention culture. I know that there's a presentation about that here, the myth of the culture in the fire service. I might take exception with that because I do think that there is a culture, an organizational culture for the fire service. But this strategy, I have to tell you, I had given up on, personally. Because what happened in Portland after we did our community emergency services in 3 pilot stations, and the captains were kicking behinds, getting data, developing relationships with the community, reaching out and doing something productive, the program died. Why? Not because the union didn't like it. The union said, if you want us to take on this work, we've got to give up something else. How about we give up the chief's inspections in Portland? What's that? It's a white glove inspection that happens once a year when one of the chiefs comes through and opens up any compartment that they feel like and do a white glove sweep. Can you imagine the amount of time spent getting a piece of apparatus in the station ready for that kind of an inspection? I'm all for maintenance, but they were willing to trade that for community emergency services, and the city turned them down. So the program died. Later tried it in Vancouver, Washington, and it also failed for a variety of reasons. So when it started coming up nationally, I'm thinking, you know what? I gave it the office. I really don't think the fire service is ready for this. But there was one man in particular that I like to mention, Bill Kehoe, who was actively, he was one of the founders for the Vision 2020 project because he found a nonprofit host, the Institution of Fire Engineers, to host the initiative. And Bill Kehoe said, we'll take this one on, and he did. And it grew into a monster. So the monster you're going to hear about later. Greg and Steve are going to talk about the details of where community risk reduction, what it is, where it's at in the country right now, but what in the heck does it have to do with us here, now, and what has Crawford been talking about all of this time? I don't know about you, but I've been here. Wake up in the morning and think, God, is it shoes first or pants? And what's my point? CRR isn't the thing. It's not just education. It's not just prevention. It is about identifying hazards. It's about figuring out what to do about those hazards. It's a process. It's a planning process that ends up potentially in a different place for every community in the country, depending on what your particular hazards are, what your priorities are, and what you're going to do about them. It is about outcome versus output. What do I mean by that? What output do we track predominantly in the fire service? Emergency response time, right? Why? It does help the outcomes. So let me frame it for you this way. We are not responding quickly to respond quickly. We're responding quickly to produce a particular outcome. What is that outcome? Let's say it's a fire. What are we trying to accomplish by responding quickly? What happens to a fire if you don't respond to it? It gets bigger. And invariably someone in class says it goes out. Well, eventually it does. But in the meantime, it's going to get bigger unless you respond. So our goal isn't to respond quickly just to get there quickly. It's to keep it from getting bigger, right? So how would I describe that as an outcome? It's not to get there within 5 minutes 90% of the time. If I'm looking at what goal I'm actually trying to accomplish, I might say something like to control the fire to the area of origin 90% of the time. And how do I do that? By getting there within 5 minutes, the proper resources. What else?
Early notification.
Sprinkler systems, early notification, building compartmentalization, and once I realized there's more than one way to solve things, bingo. You just figured out community risk reduction. It's about saying, why are we doing the things that we're doing? And how are we going to accomplish them? Right? And emergency response is part of that equation. And it's one that the community wants. So in the end, it's up to us to figure out what we're going to do that's going to be the most effective. And if we're interested in outcomes, how effectively can we do it for our community? This you'll learn more about, but it's about integrating different parts of our strategies. And I want to back up because this getting ahead of the call, are you going to talk about that a little bit, Steve, in yours? Getting ahead of the call?
No, go right ahead.
Okay, getting ahead of the call is the premise that says, what are some of the problems that we're running on frequently where maybe we could curb that? We could get in front of it and we wouldn't have to respond so many times. Like person down. Good God, this is the 4th time we've gone on this one person that's down. Couldn't we do something to get ahead of that call? You get the picture. Ideally, it's done at the station level. Why? Because the hazards in one station may be very different from the hazards in another. One of them, it's person down in the industrial area that's to be protected. The other one is assisted living centers, where your main call is I've fallen and I can't get up. And I've called 911. Why? Because the local assisted living center has a policy that says that they won't pick anybody up. It's at the station level that it's ideal. The CRR planning process is exactly what I said. It is a process, and this is the important part. It deals with all of the strategies that we call the E's: education, engineering, enforcement, and I don't like that word, goes against my grain, economic incentive, and emergency response. Education we know, emergency response we know. What is engineering? Sprinkler systems, alarm systems, seat belts, airbags, building compartmentalization, engineered solutions, okay? And there's a ton of them. Enforcement implies that we have laws and codes in place, and we are enforcing them. I prefer to say code compliance. Why? Because we can seek that, and we should seek that willingly. We don't have to assume that we've got to beat people over the head every freaking day. That's another conversation that requires alcohol. Economic incentive, that is providing incentives for people to comply. What kind of things am I talking about? Things like, let's give tax breaks for sprinkler systems. Let's give smoke alarms away. Or it could be negative economic incentives. Let's fine people for improper use of fireworks, for example, or setting their muskets off and starting the fire in their home in Jamestown. You get the picture. But it's very complicated nationally, and I do know that Steve is going to talk about this. How do we get CRR to move forward, and where is it moving forward is what they're going to talk about. All of those organizations and about 30,000 fire departments in the U.S., the challenge is in getting them to understand community risk reduction and actually to start thinking in those terms. Now, these numbers I pulled offline, they might not be 100% accurate, but they'll give you an idea. 80% of the departments in the United States are volunteer. But 50% of the people, the population in the country, are covered by paid departments. There is a standard now in terms of the evolution of community risk reduction that exists at NFPA 1300. Don't expect this to light your world on fire. Why? Because it's a standard. It dovetails, and in fact, it originated with the Vision 2020 project and work that was done on community risk reduction over a period of time. And they came together to put it down in writing, a consensus of what the CRR process is like. You're going to hear some better options later today. There is a thing called CRR Week that has evolved. And that is a group of ad hoc volunteers from around the country who say we really as a fire service need to focus on community risk reduction together. And you're going to hear a lot about Vision 2020 and community risk reduction and where things are this afternoon. So I wanted to end a little bit early so that we had time to break down and set up, but I do have some time for some questions. I want to end with this thought. CRR and evolution was personal for me. It began with being a firefighter and loving it. I couldn't believe that they were paying me money to do that. I just loved it. And eventually I evolved because I was motivated to get out in front of it. Couldn't I do something that would prevent some of these problems from occurring? That's not for everybody. I get that. That's appropriate. But when some of us are oriented in that direction and we begin to look holistically as a fire service to say, why are we here? It's not just to respond. My dream is that fire service begins to compare themselves one to another, or more appropriately, themselves to their previous selves to say, how safe is our community? That's the ultimate outcome metric that we can look at. And that is community risk reduction. And it doesn't start with one event, and it doesn't start with one person. It starts with just everything else in history. It begins with this, and someone looks at it and goes, how could we make that better? And then it goes to this point, and this point, and this point. And that is how community risk reduction evolved from the first days in Egypt when they were doing community risk reduction by putting fires out before they got bigger. That's when community risk reduction, at least the first ones that I've been able to find, started. And why we call it reduction, that also requires alcohol and occurs at a later time. I hope that's been helpful for you. I do know that you're going to get more solid information in the other presentations, but that's my opinion, how things kind of evolved to this point. Can I answer any questions for you while I'm here? Life in general, dating, anything at all? Okay, you've been great. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.